Welcome to another episode of the Admiral's Almanac. I'm your host, Rear Admiral Gary Hall, United States Navy retired, and I'm here in Coronado, California. It's a beautiful, crisp morning right next to the ocean. I'm here with one of our favorite guests, Navy Captain and best-selling author, George Galdarisi. Good morning, George.
Hey, Gary. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast. It's always a pleasure.
And George is one of our most popular guests, and we talk a lot about leadership and writing, and this is episode 3 in a series of 6 episodes on writing. In episodes 1 and 2, we talked about why you should write, why leaders should write, and how to start writing. Now we're going to get into the meat of the matter, right, George?
Yeah, I think so. We talked about why you should write articles, and now we're taking more meaty subjects, actually talking about books, and this one, nonfiction.
Yeah, and George is a New York Times bestseller, both fiction and nonfiction, and his leadership in the United States Navy was a highlight. His writing in professional journals, and so that his leadership carries on. So he was expert leader on the ground, in the air, at sea, on staff, a tremendous career, and I'm proud to say he was one of my mentors. So also, he's written with one of his friends a book from brave ship writers share their secrets, how to write books people actually read. And I think that's an important thing, writing something that people will actually read. Now, in that book, you say that nonfiction is the hungry market. Can you tell us about that?
I think the best way to describe that, Gary, is if you go to a library or your local bookstore, you'll see some fiction, but you'll see the shelves groaning over all of the nonfiction books. They tremendously populate the fiction. It's such a vast landscape. The nice thing about nonfiction is that if you write a novel, you've got to write the entire novel before you can approach an agent or a publisher. But with nonfiction, you basically write a short proposal and throw that over the transom to an agent or publisher, and then they either accept it or they don't. But if they don't, you haven't expended 80,000 words trying to get published. And so it's easier to query and it's lower risk that you can pitch it without writing the whole book.
Yeah, and as you know, I wrote a nonfiction, Navigating Leadership, Making a Pact with Excellence. I self-published on Amazon, and what's amazing is Amazon gets about 2 million submissions a year, and probably 80% of those that is an option. And so you've used the quote in the past, history is what the historians and writers say it is. So tell us a little bit more about that.
That's a quote by Norman Palmar, and Norman is one of my mentors. He's written probably 40 books, most of them having to do with naval history. If you think about that quote, things happen, and people write it down, whether it's 1 year, 5 years, or 20 years later. That's the only evidence that something happens. History is what the historians and writers say it is, I think is something that most of us who write have on a Post-it note on our computer monitor.
Right, and so I think there's all sorts of nonfictions, and how do you pick what to write? As I told a bunch of naval aviators, almost every flight when you're deployed could be an article or something to write nonfiction, but how do you know what to write for nonfiction?
Well, Gary, I'm glad you mentioned flying, because most of us who spent our careers in the air were passionate about it, and that's exactly what my first agent said. Is you're trying to pick something, what are you really passionate about? What do you wish you had more time for? What do you think about when you're alone? What issues concern you? Or is there something that your friends always turn to you for advice? That really gets to your inner core of what's important to you. The key is not just trying to follow a trend by reading the list of best-selling books, but pick something that you happen to be passionate about.
Yeah, and recently I was talking to a Chaldean priest here in San Diego, and he's got his PhD in philosophy. So many times he's asked questions about philosophy, theology, the Catholic faith, the Chaldean. So he's written books to answer these processes. So, maybe you have somebody asking you questions and, you have enough to write a book. In Brave Ship, writers share their secrets. You break nonfiction down into a couple of categories. What are those categories that we should be looking at in nonfiction?
Yeah, there's the two big streams. The first one, Gary, is narrative nonfiction. It's a book that tells a true story, often using techniques of fiction. There are biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs, things that tell a story. And then there's prescriptive nonfiction. These are books that help people improve their lives, whether it's a cooking book, whether it's a religious book, whether it's a fitness book. And that's how those books are focused. So there's two big branches, and most people who want to write a book probably need to put themselves into one of those two streams because that's kind of defines it.
Now, the narrative nonfiction, that kind of intrigues me. And I was thinking, can you use figurative nonfiction? In other words, you have narrators that are fictitious.
I think whether it's historical nonfiction or some other type, you can take some liberties and be the narrator. One popular type of narrative nonfiction is alternative history. My co-author with the Brave Ship Writers book did a book in which his high concept was the South won the Civil War and what happened in the United States going forward in World War I, World War II, etc. You can do that, and it's very interesting if you do. A lot of people who want to do narrative nonfiction focus on memoirs. The key to memoirs is finding something new to say. Some people may want to write a memoir about their grandfather who served in World War I or something like that. But it's got to trigger interest, and you have to ask yourself, well, who would want to read this other than someone in your family? So that's not to be a buzzkill, but it is something you need to take into account. An example of narrative nonfiction at the top of the list, Walter Isaacson, who's done many biographies, Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, did a biography of Steve Jobs. And if you're at all attuned to the high-tech world, it's fascinating and riveting. It's very skillfully done, and that's the key.
Yeah, one of my friends just wrote a narrative nonfiction about her father, who was an executive chef to the celebrities. So was a chef to Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and so that became a very compelling story. Now I'm interested in the alt history. As a Buffalo native, Buffalo Bills fan, can we write a nonfiction narrative that the Bills won two or three of those four Super Bowls back in the 90s? That would be a great alternate history.
They just beat the Lions yesterday, so there you go.
Yeah, not only was that a great win for me, but how about Navy controlling Army this past weekend in the Army-Navy football game?
We're all still celebrating.
So I got a call from a West Point grad to congratulate me and said Army found out that what they normally do wasn't working. So,
well said.
What is prescriptive nonfiction? How about working us through that?
Yeah, prescriptive is trying to help you learn something, how to make your life better. The nice thing about prescriptive nonfiction is you don't have to be that skilled as a writer. In other words, you have something to share. Let's say it's cooking. Let's say it's fitness. And you don't have to be a top of the charts writer like a Walter Isaacson or someone like that. You just have to find the hook of something that you know a lot about and other people might find interesting or even life-changing. One good example of that is Marie Kondo's book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, the Japanese art of decluttering and organizing. For people like me who's a pack rat, it's life-changing. You have to get rid of stuff, and I think the most important line in her book is, if it doesn't bring you joy, get rid of it. But again, it's something that people want to learn about because you're such an expert.
Marie Kondo, that is an amazing book. By the time we're done with our Navy career, we've got so many memorabilia. You actually have to hold it and say, does this spark joy in my life? We haven't talked about memoirs. What do you think about those as far as nonfiction?
If you're going to write a memoir of your life or a relative's life, you have to ask yourself, who else would read this besides a family member? The other trick about memoirs is if you tried to write about someone's entire life, that's really difficult. So 2 examples, I helped a former Army Ranger write his memoir about his time in Afghanistan. We didn't take it all the way back to when he was born and growing up and stuff like that, we focused on 1 year in Afghanistan. He was a Ranger sniper and did some amazing things. Conversely, I helped a fellow who was a Border Patrol agent. And oh, by the way, that book by that sniper sold very well, published by Macmillan. I helped another gentleman who was a Border Patrol agent do his memoir, and he insisted that it encompassed his whole life, and it took it, back to growing up in the LA area, and all the way to, his end of his career as a Border Patrol agent and what he's doing now. And it was too much. It wasn't focused enough, and it didn't sell very well, quite frankly, because it didn't focus on the most exciting part of his life. So that's the advice, I guess, anyone who's interested in a memoir is focus it down to not everything, just the most important part.
Right, and I think when it comes to something like a memoir, you might not want to write it to be a bestseller in New York Times, but maybe you do want to write it for your family. You and I have mentors that have gone on to their next life, and you read the obituary or the memorial in the pamphlet, and it was Uncle Billy was in the Navy. Uncle Billy was captain of a destroyer at the Bay of Pigs. So you may want to write just for your family. Not every book gets published by a major or makes a lot of money, but any book can be important to the writer and to family members. If you're thinking about it, maybe write something so that your family has a legacy piece. What are the hurdles of getting nonfiction books published?
There are so many people who want to write a nonfiction book that whether it's an agent or a publisher, there's three. You remember the old terms from the movies, four shields up. The first thing they'll say is it's an article, not a book. In other words, it's a good idea, but there's not enough for an entire 70,000 word book. Then they might say, well, it's already been done or it's on Wikipedia. So how does your book inform people more than what they could find on Wikipedia on the subject? And the last thing is they'll say you don't have a platform. And that means you're not on social media that much, and people, as you mentioned, there's 2 million books thrown over the transom on Amazon every year. How does your book get noticed? If you wanted to do a nonfiction book on cooking, the first question the publisher will ask is, do you have a cooking show on TV? Or do you make the rounds throughout the country doing cooking talks? So those are the things you have to overcome to get past the gatekeepers.
Yeah, and that's, what is your platform? Like you just said, are you on TV or do you have a YouTube channel, things of that nature? Does social media help at all?
Social media does. What people need to wrestle with when they do books is how much time are you spending writing and how much time are you spending on social media trying to promote what you write. And there's no easy answer to that, but it is a zero-sum game in many ways, because if you're trying to be on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram and everything, you're probably not going to have much time to write anything of quality.
So how do you overcome those Heisman maneuvers by a publisher?
I'm glad you asked that. I want to give you an example of a book I did some years ago with a co-author called The Kissing Sailor. Most people remember that famous Alfred Eisenstadt photo of the sailor kissing the nurse on August 14th, 1945, when the war was over. My co-author, Aria, and I won't get into the details here because we only have so much time, but he found the fella who was the kissing sailor. He expended a lot of energy proving that he was the sailor through forensic means and other means, and he wrote 80,000 words. But he didn't have an agent, and he didn't have a publisher, so he was kind of adrift in what to do. So through a lot of friendships and other areas, we teamed up to do the book. His original title for the book was My Search for the Kissing Sailor. We changed it to The Kissing Sailor and focused on 5 things. On the picture, which is one of the 2 most famous pictures that came out of World War II, the other being the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. The publication, Life magazine, which was the premier publication for the greatest generation. The place, Times Square, which is still the center of the world. The people, the 3 principals, the 2 people in the picture, and then Alfred Eisenstadt, and then the proof. So we really turned that around and made it a book by having that pretty broad focus, not just the proof that George Mendonça was a sailor. So it requires some thought and creativity to actually overcome those three speed bumps.
Isn't the end game getting a publisher to buy your book?
Yeah, that's the key. You want to find a publisher who publishes that kind of book and an agent who agents that kind of book. I've spoken at many writing conferences, and at most of those, they'll bring in publishers, editors, they'll bring in agents, and almost every editor at a publishing house and every agent specializes in only two or three things. They don't say, send me anything. They'll say, I specialize in romance, young adult, and paranormal. So you've got to find that agent. Otherwise, you're really wasting your time. And then it's all about the query letter. Without going into detail, you can exhaust yourself trying to write the perfect query letter. You don't need to do that. And I'll amplify that a little bit downstream.
Yeah, George, we have friends and colleagues that have been successful writing, and I think persistence is the key. There's so many roadblocks that you have to be persistent. I think you've even said you need to be persistent on steroids, and I have one of my co-pilots, his talented daughter, for 5 years trying to get published, and just recently had a fiction book published, and they've ordered another one with a six-figure upfront fees. Persistence does work. The wife of one of our squadron pilots decided to start writing romance novels about Navy helicopter pilots, and she is definitely a well-read and written dozens of romance novels. So find your niche and be persistent and don't give up. But it can be complicated. Can you give us a little bit more about how we go about? Give us the inside baseball of getting published.
Thanks for that. This is something I really emphasize when I do writing seminars. It's pretty straightforward. So you've got your book, and you go, there's thousands of literary agents in the United States. Who do you query? If you go to the library and find books like your book, most writers are kind enough to thank their agents in their acknowledgments. So you get those agents and you send your queries to those agents, and you say something like, I saw that you agented Johnny Jones' book about murder in the Coronado Library. I've got a book, Murder in Spreckles Park, but it's more edgy. It's got a protagonist who is handicapped, or whatever the case may be. You're showing the agent that you've done your due diligence and know what kind of books this agent works with. It gets you from a list of thousands of agents to maybe a dozen. So you're querying them, and it works. People find that inside baseball way of doing it very useful.
And now with with intelligence, there's a lot of ways to figure out how to write your query letter. And so, yeah, there's a lot of information out there on the internet, and also the rising influence of artificial intelligence. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about AI here near the end of this discussion today. So let's talk a little bit about the book proposal.
Yeah, think about when you first started your professional life and your first job interview. It's not the time for humility. When you wrote your first resume, it's pretty straightforward. You want to define the book's audience, describe the book generally and specifically, and you want to show that book, that nonfiction book, fills a need for your audience, that it's something that's not on Wikipedia or it hasn't been written before, and then show that you're uniquely qualified to write this book. It just means that you should offer something new. For instance, when Mary Shelley wrote her book Frankenstein, there have been scores of Frankenstein books following hers because people found some aspect of that hadn't been done by previous writers. So again, you've got to convince somebody that it's something new. And again, hearkening back to that Kissing Sailor book, no one had proven who the people were, and had been controversial for decades. And so that was our niche. That was our inside baseball.
Yeah, and I do recommend, dear listeners, go to Amazon, search for The Kissing Sailor, and you'll find it quite intriguing. And I found that the forensics of how many people claim to be the kissing sailor and how you came about determining who it actually was. It's a great sleuth in forensics to find out who the actual couple was. In your book, Brave Ship writers share their secrets. You and Kevin McDonald touch on your own nonfiction books. Can you tell us a little bit about the secrets you used to getting them published?
Kevin and I were squadron mates in the H-60 community back in the day. Once he completed his naval service, he went back to Texas and flew medical evacuation helicopters for over 20 years. You've seen them on TV when they lift someone off the highway who's been in a car accident or off a mountainside that fell during an avalanche or something. Anyway, he wrote that as a memoir, but he came up with a title that was so intriguing that the book sold well. The title was Inside the Dead Man's Curve. Gary, you and I know as aviators that there were regimes you should fly in and regimes you shouldn't. The ones you shouldn't fly in were the dead man's curve. If something happened, you lost an engine, you're dead. Well, Kevin spent his career flying inside the dead man's curve because of the challenge of medically evacuating people. That was the hook that got people super interested in that book. It sold very well, and it's carried him on in his career.
Now, George, tell me the title of your latest book on artificial intelligence.
Thanks for that. My co-author, Sam Tangredi, and I did a book called Algorithms of Armageddon. It's our most recent nonfiction book. The point of high concept of the book is what happens when you insert artificial intelligence into military weapon systems. There's enough. Artificial intelligence is an area where there's vastly more heat than light. Elon Musk tells us AI is going to destroy the world, and that's why we all have to move to Mars. It's a book that walks through the challenges and opportunities of inserting AI into military weapon systems, something that our peer competitors, China and Russia, are actually ahead of us. The prescriptive part of that book is the United States needs to be more proactive in using AI to thwart our enemies.
Okay, here's the challenge. You just described your book. Now let's go back to our discussion on book proposals. And so let's just talk about a proposal for that book. If you go to the last 4 points on a book proposal. So who is that book's audience?
Yeah, well, I think the book's audience is people who are interested in technology, the military, and people who have been scared by the media about AI being a bad thing. Tech giants have said things like AI will destroy the human race. So that's a pretty wide audience because that kind of argument has dominated the media in many ways.
So describe your book generally and specifically.
So the book, first of all, goes through the history of AI. Some people think that AI just got invented last Tuesday morning. It really has a rich history that goes back over 100 years. It's a history of how we got to where AI is today. It describes what AI is doing in the world today, in the civilian and military world, and then it talks about what the United States needs to do to stay ahead of our peer competitors.
So you also say in writing a proposal letter, show that your book fills a need for your audience. And you may have already answered that in other questions, but how does your book fill a need for?
Yeah, well, we did our due diligence before we wrote our proposal. Part of the due diligence is always describing books that are like yours or closely like yours. And the fact was there wasn't anything out there that connected AI and military. So that was our niche and fulfilled a need because no one had done that before.
My mother was a real character, and she talked about moderation. She said, sex, fire, and alcohol are all good things if used in moderation. And I think that's also appropriate with artificial intelligence. And so for any listeners that are in big corporations, you're a vice president, CEO, COO, and thinking about AI, you better get a policy out there because your 20-something employees are using it in their work. And so you need to have an artificial intelligence policy. But if you're a writer, hopefully you're a good writer. And so you might be able to write the correct prompts so that artificial intelligence doesn't hallucinate. Any final comments on your book? Tell us the title again, where we can get it, and who should read it.
The book is Algorithms of Armageddon, and it's on Amazon, published by the Naval Institute Press. We wrote it primarily as a passion project that would inform people and make them less worried about AI, especially in U.S. military weapon systems.
Fantastic. One final anecdote. As I was driving here, I was pulled over for speeding, and the cop says, "Do you know you were speeding?" I said, "No, officer, I was trying to keep up with traffic." And he said, "Why, there is no traffic around you whatsoever." And I said, "See how far behind I am?" That's how you might feel about writing. You might feel you're far behind, but you're not. Today is the day to get started writing your nonfiction article or book, and persistence on steroids is the recommendation by our New York Times best-selling publisher, George Galdarisi. Be persistent. George, do you want to wrap up this episode? Any last thoughts?
If you're interested in pursuing this, if you go to my website, which is, if you just Google my name, George Galdarisi, it'll pull up my website. I've got two things there. I've got a deck of PowerPoint slides that discuss writing nonfiction in more detail than we've had time to go through on this broadcast. I blog on several subjects, so one of them is writing. So there's writing tips there for beginning, emerging, and even accomplished writers. That's your departing gift that you can go on the website and mine some of that for your own use.
George Galdarisi, leader, influencer, writer, New York Times bestselling author. Thank you, George, for hosting me this morning in your beautiful home here in Coronado, California on this crisp Navy day, post-Army-Navy 31-13 Navy's win. So God bless you all. Thank you.